thanks for stopping by the channel. Make sure you are subscribed and you're checking out the bell icon down there so that you're getting notifications. And like, comment over here. Like, comment, and share. I am thrilled, actually, and humbled to have Chris Wiley with me today. For those of you who aren't familiar, and if you're not familiar, then you will be. Chris is a theologian and a philosopher and an author, and I think you have 14 different books that you're working on right now. I think you're working on some Tolkien stuff. You're working on some young adult fiction, and now you're working on something with what is it? Lovecraft and Lewis at the same time.
Right. Yeah.
You're trying to get alienated and isolated from every community. So, Chris, thanks for coming on. Tell me a little bit about your writing projects.
Yeah, thanks, TC. Well, I just finished up a book on Tom Bombadil that I'm told will come out anytime now. And of course, that's kind of a Tolkien project. I'm working on a couple of books for kids, fiction. I have a young adult series, and I have the second book that I'm just about done with. Was just working on it this morning. And then I'm working kind of on and off again on a children's picture book. And I'm the illustrator for it, and obviously the author for it. And then the project you just described, the Lovecraft Lewis thing. Years ago, I wrote a piece for Touchstone magazine on Lewis and Lovecraft, and it went over pretty well in both the fan bases, both the Lovecraft world and the Lewis world. And it seemed to me that it provided an opportunity to do some cultural apologetics. It's really, you have with Lewis and Lovecraft a number of remarkable sort of parallels, but you also have some important distinctions, especially when it comes to cosmology. So and then their different understandings of the cosmos lead to different ways of thinking about evil and monsters and things like that. And that is really quite relevant for us in our world. And so I thought it'd be worthwhile doing writing a book on Lewis and Lovecraft. I don't have a publisher or anything yet. I'm just in the very early stages of kind of thinking about that project. Like I said, I have got these other projects I need to get behind me first.
I start a lot of writing projects and never finish them, so I'm probably need to do what you do. So I'm going to ask this, get this out of the way. So you just here a few weeks ago attended the PCA General Assembly,
right?
And having read and listened to you now for a few years, I know that you tend to have a very sharp take, and not in a negative way, on the culture, and oftentimes in the way the church is being permeated by the culture. And what's your takeaway as you walk in a 50,000 foot overview of the General Assembly this year? What's your take on the culture and the direction the PCA is headed right now? Do you see it? Do you see a schism coming, or?
Well, well, it's hard to say. I mean, the assembly this year was a marvelous corrective to the assembly in Dallas 2 years ago. At the end of that assembly, and I was there for that, I had very bad feelings coming away from that assembly, and I was sure we were heading to a schism. But something happened between that assembly and this assembly that I don't think we expected to see. And I give COVID the credit in God's providence for what happened. And here's why. We didn't meet last year for the assembly because of COVID. What that meant is that the conservatives, who generally speaking are in more rural and sort of traditional areas, had extra time to organize and raise funds and show up in mass to this year's assembly. I don't know if that could have happened with just a year's time, to prepare. But with 2 years, we had a far larger representation by ruling elders, for example, and ruling elders from, churches that never come to General Assembly or never send anybody to General Assembly. So we had a very different sort of mix at St. Louis than we had at Dallas. Furthermore, I think that the COVID stuff really hit the national partnership churches hard. So the more progressive element of or sort of wing of the PCA, some of those churches have not met at all since the whole COVID thing, and the restrictions on worship and so forth were put in place. So a lot of the conservatives, have been working hard to meet as much as they can. Some have completely ignored COVID restrictions and have just gone ahead and done their thing.
Yeah.
And those churches have done pretty well in the past year. They've actually grown. I think there's been a COVID bump for a lot of conservative churches because they've just simply been meeting, in mega churches and seeker-sensitive churches and woke churches just have not been meeting. So people who were already kind of disgruntled with those places just decided to make the shift and come over to churches that were actually worshiping and meeting. And so I think there was a twofold sort of dynamic with COVID. One of the things I just described was we had a lot more conservative sort of kind of heartland PCA ruling elder types and even teaching elder types who came out to this assembly precisely because they wanted to make sure that they were there for the votes on the overtures related to homosexuality and so forth. But also the guys in the big cities and the cool churches and the whole RUF kind of network, they were underrepresented this time. There were fewer of those guys there than there were at Dallas.
I find it very encouraging to hear you say that. As I said it when we were doing pre-recording, I Reformed Calvinistic Baptist going to a Presbyterian church, a PCA of all things, and watching, because I've had struggles. It's virtually impossible for me to find a genuinely Reformed Baptist church within a decent drive time for me, without driving 3 to 4 hours sometimes.
So where are you, TC?
I'm down in the southeast corner of Minnesota.
Oh, okay, sure.
So I'm virtually in Iowa. Most people think I am in Iowa, but I'm another 20 miles away from there. But so it's been interesting for me, and I watched the Revoice fiasco build and was actually taken aback from 2 years ago when there wasn't a resounding stifling of that particular wing of the PCA. And I find it terribly ironic that this year it was in St. Louis, which was, of course, home to the Revoice fiasco, and it sounds like you guys maybe put that down pretty well.
Yeah, we'll see. Hopefully it's not a Pyrrhic victory or something like that.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems that we're going to face is just follow through. Now that the overtures have been, sent to the presbyteries, there's just a sort of the work of following through. And one of the problems that conservatives have always had in the Protestant world for time out of mind is staying on task, because generally speaking, conservatives just kind of want to tend their own gardens and mind their own business. And consequently, when the crisis passes, they go back to normal. And this is one of the things that makes them great. I mean, it's one of the aspects of conservatism that I think is marvelous. It's a mind your own business kind of outlook, and just do what's right, and do what makes sense, and do what is traditionally proven to be sound. And whereas progressives generally are ensconced in bureaucracies, they're activists by nature. They live for this kind of stuff. They're always strategizing, they're always planning, they're always communicating, they're always showing up at the worst possible moments in mass. When I was in Dallas, There were a number of conservatives who, going into that General Assembly, felt like we had done our work. There were a number of things that you could be encouraged about. There were people on ballots that, if they had been elected, would have been a great voice. Would have provided voices that were corrective in nature. But we were completely outclassed and outmaneuvered in Dallas, and you could just feel it. The glee, you could hear it. The glee, on the floor of the presbytery at certain points from the national partnership and the progressive wing of the church. And that's why a number of people left. That's why this whole Vanguard Presbytery thing kind of got rolling along, and we saw a number of guys, small number, but some good guys, leave the PCA over that assembly. And I thought the national partnership had all the momentum at that point. Like I said, it was the COVID thing that I think completely caught them by surprise, and they anyway, it's a different story now. But hopefully, something positive will stick from this assembly.
Yeah, it's definitely a different story than what you hear coming out of the Southern Baptist Convention, even again this year, where maybe some strides made in awareness, but definitely no strides made in leadership. In fact, if it could have gotten worse for the Southern Baptist Convention, especially if you listen to the guys from Sword in the Trowel,
Right,
Longshore and Askell,
right.
I don't know that you could have gotten worse outside of maybe just a radical Marxist who then plagiarized somebody else's sermon. So
Right.
so I'm over here watching, I was ready for a schism in the PCA, and not anticipating it in a positive light, but saying there's a fight coming. And so I'm actually encouraged to hear you say that, because I haven't gotten a lot of feedback from a lot of people. It's the Baptists are a lot different than the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians always play everything really close to the vest. They don't want to they don't air their dirty laundry. The Baptists, they can't get to a microphone fast enough. So I think this is actually a really good segue to talk a little bit about, and I don't throw this out there lightly, I think maybe one of the most pivotal books in my life as a Christian was your book, The Household and the War for the Cosmos.
Oh, wow.
And I think it's because it resonated with me. I can even tell you where I went through. Now, I read oftentimes by listening, and because I do a lot of busy work, and I do a lot of landscaping and stuff in the summer. And it was just a couple of years ago, I was sitting on a lawnmower at my daughter and my son-in-law's place, listening to your reading for the first time, The Household and the War for the Cosmos, and saying, wow, this resonates with me. This is why all of these things are so important to me. And this is pre-COVID.
Right.
And because I've been seeing these things, I'm kind of a Schaeffer nut. I'm not an official,
Sure.
I don't know everything, but I love Schaeffer, and Schaeffer resonates with me. And I would imagine you probably have read much of his stuff. And I'm like, okay, now I understand why Schaeffer resonates with me. And I don't feel so out there and alone. And then I came across your book, and I was like, holy crow, I'm not crazy. This is historic.
Right.
The thing that, a couple of the things about that, and I'd kind of like to see how you came. Do you have this intersection? Not to use the
No, I understand.
But you have this intersection that you talk an awful lot about in the course of the book, and I would like for you to kind of give the people who will hear this a little bit of a teaser about these two characters that run throughout the history of the world, that keep intersecting in their history. How did you come up with that? How did you discover it? What did you see it on your own?
Yeah, you're thinking about Aeneas and Abraham?
Yes.
Right. Well, I think that the importance of Aeneas to Christians in the first century is one of these open secrets. I don't see how people really can miss it with in a way, because, well, for example, I'm rereading Augustine's City of God right now, and he starts the whole thing off talking about Aeneas, and so within the world of you know antiquity, in the first century in particular, Aeneas looms very large. And right in Acts, it's a chapter, I think it's chapter 10, where there's a healing of a character named Aeneas.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right after the conversion of the Apostle Paul. We segue back to Peter, and then we have a series of things that occur before Peter goes to Cornelius's house, and Cornelius, of course, is a Roman centurion. But there are these events which signal that the Christian faith, the gospel, is about to enter the empire and transform it. And one of the things that signals this is the healing of Aeneas, this character who can't walk. Now, that's ironic. And everybody who heard the book of Acts read aloud in the churches in the first and second century would have gotten the joke. It would have been like saying there was a guy named George Washington. For Americans, everybody understood the importance of Aeneas. Aeneas was believed to be the progenitor, the person through whom the Roman people came into being. He was the father of the Roman people. And his story was told by Virgil in the Aeneid. And in that story, Aeneas flees Troy. Troy has been sacked by the Greeks. Mm-hmm. And as he flees, he carries his father Anchises on his back, because his father is a cripple. So he's carrying his father out of the city, and he has his son Ilius by the hand, and then in the other hand, he's got his sword. So it's a beautiful picture of three generations. And it's an image of piety. In the first century, pius, the Latin word that we translate into the English word piety, meant devotion to duty. And it meant duty not only to the gods, but to your father, to your children, to your household. So for people in the first century, there was no sort of division between your responsibilities to your household and family and your responsibility to the ancestors and your responsibility to the gods. So this is the background. And when Aeneas is cured by Peter in Acts 10, what is being said is that the empire is crippled and Christ is going to heal it. And so Aeneas takes his bed and walks, and that's the sign. Again, this is ironic because in the story of the Aeneid, Aeneas is this virile man, great warrior, who's carrying his father on his back. But now he can't walk. That's the joke. Aeneas can't walk. Now, I believe that Aeneas in this particular episode in Acts is a real historical person named Aeneas. But I think, the story is communicating on two levels. Now, getting back to Abraham, Aeneas, the Roman people believed that they were the heirs of the world, that they were called to govern the world justly and to be the ruling people. Well, it just so happened that there was another group of people called Jews who felt the same way. They had a founding father named Abraham.
Conflict is looming.
That's right. And the heir of Abraham, the heir who is the heir of the world, is guess who? The Son of God, the Lord Jesus Christ. So in the first century, there is this clash, this conflict of cosmologies and visions. And, the Caesars were believed to be sons of the gods, and they were believed to be seated in heavenly places with the gods. We actually have artifacts from the first century that depict Augustus in heavenly places surrounded by the gods. And so when Paul in Ephesians says Christ has ascended on high as is seated in heavenly places, it's a direct assertion that Caesar is not God. Jesus is God, and that the empire will eventually become the possession of the Lord Jesus Christ, in fact, even as it is in truth, because he's already ascended on high. So this is the background in which, the Christians in the first centuries of the church were doing their evangelistic work. They were making some pretty bold claims that were considered very threatening to the established powers.
Yeah, they were insurrectionists, for lack of better terminology,
right.
Just because of their rejection of the Roman Empire and the Roman emperors as deity.
Right.
They didn't care who you worshiped at all. That you could worship whoever you wanted, but you also had to acknowledge Rome and acknowledge Caesar as Lord,
right?
In
That's
a
right.
deific way. I like that you clarified that you see Aeneas both as a historical figure and also as a symbol of what is to come, because I think what we see a lot, and if you disagree, please tell me. But what we see a lot, especially in modern Western Christian culture, is either an overemphasis on everything is just symbolic, and we approach it from an emotional perspective of, I feel this way about the symbiology that's here, or everything has to be taken only literally, and therefore that what happened to Aeneas has no other meaning than Jesus was performing a miracle, and now this guy's healed and he gets up and walks away. And we hear that. Outside of what you said in the book, I had never heard that before.
Yeah, I think that we have a sub-Christian view of sort of history and its relationship to eternal matters. So you and I are both at one and the same moment individuals,
Yep,
and the images of God. It's not an either or situation.
right.
It's a both and situation. So as we look at human history, we can see things that are going on that are, are things that can be understood sort of historically and contingently. And at the same time, we can say, well, these are also things that point to, larger realities and point to and reflect, God's providential ordering of things. And so, we can understand things in a way that are, doesn't put these things at odds with each other, but actually recognizes these are two dimensions of something that is real.
The very interesting thing about what you said about the both and is that what I observe a lot in my area is a hands-off approach to the world by Christians, very hands-off, or overboard, which is to go completely into the progressive movement, which is everything has to be hands-on. And we talk about doing things through a gospel lens, but we're really never actually bringing the gospel to bear in a hands-on way, because for a lot of people, the gospel is, that's just that thing you hear so that you can be saved. And now you go out and you do a bunch of really good works and devoid of the gospel. And that brings me kind of this, what I saw in the War for the Cosmos was that a proper view of piety, and that's huge, because you know this, people, you throw that word piety out and you relate that very well in different ways throughout the book. You throw the word piety out there and everybody has this idea of people sitting on poles or so holy that they're striving so much for holiness, which we should be striving for, that they don't take any action in the world. They isolate and become almost cloistered monks of, if you will, and they don't do anything. And what I'm seeing throughout the book as I'm going through is, no, this kind of piety that you talk about, and how important the household or that family structure is, actually should stir you up to fight. Not necessarily, and maybe their place in some senses physically at times, but should stir you up to be engaged in the fight, because the household should be dictating the direction that culture is going. And am I wrong in perceiving it that way? Is that what you were, one of the things you were pointing at?
Well, it's definitely what I was pointing at. I think when we think about the cosmos, the Greek word cosmos means order. And what we have, and often it's the word cosmos or cosmos is translated into the English word world. Mm-hmm. And I think because of that, we can miss something that we shouldn't miss. And what I'm getting at is that there is a divinely ordered sort of nature to things, and it's really not subject to our revision. So, for example, Christ and the church. Christ and the church, the relationship between Christ and the church is real, and it's not the case that the Apostle Paul sat around thinking about, well, what would be a great analogy or metaphor to sort of point to the relationship between Christ and the church. Oh, I know, a groom and his bride. That's not how Paul thought about it. We can see that wasn't the way he thought about it just by looking at Ephesians closely. The way he thought about it is this. Grooms and brides reflect an eternal reality, and that eternal reality is Christ and the church. So as we go about the work of living in our households as men and women, husbands and wives, we are participating in a larger reality. That larger reality is the relationship between Christ and the church. And because of that, we're not free to kind of just do this on our own or make up the rules as we go along. When we do that, we're actually engaged in a kind of fantasy that doesn't have any substance. But when we participate in the relationship that we see between Christ and the church and try to live out that reality, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Wives, submit to your husbands and respect them. When we live that out the way that we should, we are participating in something bigger than ourselves, something that's real. Yeah. And that means that our households can tell the story, or should tell the story, of reality in the final sense, the end of the world, its purpose, but also the way things really are now. And I think that so many of the nutty things that you see in the church today when it comes to households and families and egalitarianism and all this other kind of stuff is due to the fact that we don't really believe that the relationship between Christ and the church is fundamentally real and that it's the basis for our households. We think that it's just kind of like a cute little, sort of illustration that Paul kind of dreamed up, but is no longer relevant to our situation today because of, culture has changed and da-da-da-da-da. That's nonsense. The Apostle Paul was not just sort of arbitrarily making a choice and sort of glossing over certain cultural features. He was actually showing us that creation and new creation connect.
Yeah. That's it. We're done. We don't even have to talk anymore. Oh.
Yeah. So anyway, as you can tell, I'm a politically incorrect sort of person, the kind of person that egalitarians just find scary.
Yeah, well, there are soft complementarians who are scared of you too.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Um, well, that and you also have a working relationship and a friendship with he who shall not be named. So,
Voldemort.
yes, there you go.
Well, it's funny thing. I know you're talking about Doug. Doug and I are friends, and I've got a number of other friends that make Doug seem tame. And when people talk to me about,
are you sure you want to say that?
When people talk to me about, my controversial friend Doug, I say, well, Doug is not the most controversial friend I have.
Yeah.
Anyway, I can talk about the other ones if you like, but anyway. But Doug, by the way, Doug is probably, I think, he's misjudged. I mean, my wife and I have had dinner with him and Nancy, half a dozen times. He's one of the most easy to get along with and approachable people you'd ever want to meet.
Yeah, everybody I know that's met him is like, why is everybody so scared of him? He's so down to earth. I want to. How do I want to? It's not a transition as much. When you talk about in your book, you talk about Aeneas and the loss of his wife, and she has this very moving, this is very, very Mediterranean, way of wives would speak in all of the ancient literature. They're always that figure. It's never the figure that's holding the husband back. It's always, she's always inspiring him.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And that's what she does. She's dead, and she's talking to him, and she compels Aeneas to fight. Ultimately, she compels him to fight. Do you see what is happening in particular for the church in the United States, in the republic such as it is right now? Do you believe that if we were to recapture the household and the understanding of how important it is, that we would see a revival of sorts, not in the the Finneyite kind of way, but that a revival of sorts of people going out and saying, like, enough is enough. The world belongs to God, and in a non actual militant way, as Christian households, we should be fighting to conquer the evils of the world because it matters to my home. Do you think that's? Do you think that is something that we're missing today in the church, in the context of the visible church?
Yeah, I think we are. I think in part it has to do with a way of thinking about relating to the world, and the sense I get from most people who promote church growth is that we have to attract people in ways that are culturally sort of, I guess, palatable to people. So we can't say or do things that just prima facie could turn off a lot of folks. We really do rely on a kind of marketing and sort of public relations approach to things that makes us the servants, or makes us, sort of very vulnerable to the opinions of people who don't know Christ. So we often, censor ourselves and water things down so that we won't offend anybody. But I think that we need to recover an apostolic confidence. That's a term that I was introduced to by a guy named George Hunter, who was a Methodist sort of mission scholar And I heard him say that back in the late 80s, early 90s, and it just always stuck with me. And what he was getting at is that we're not marketers. We're not people who are out there selling stuff that people are already looking for. What we are is people who are boldly proclaiming the truth, and we're telling people things that they don't necessarily want to hear. And one of those things is, this is reality, whether you like it or not. This is reality. And if you fail to conform to reality, reality doesn't, its feelings are not hurt one little bit. It just rolls right over you like a juggernaut and crushes you. And what we need to do is, if we genuinely love people and if we genuinely have compassion for people, we got to stop giving them the impression that reality can conform to them and their desires. They need to conform to what is real. And if they don't, they will die. And so our work as evangelists, as preachers, is to proclaim reality with a capital R, and call people to conform to it for their own good. And now, I don't think that that's something that will be, that will happen in the near term. And I don't think that it's something, at least on a large scale. And I also don't think that even when we do see the church kind of coming along and doing that, the world will be all that pleased with what we do and say.
You mean they're not going to just jump on board and go, "Oh wow, these Christians got it right"? So
that's right. No, I think they will double down on dumb and really come at us even harder. But if we play the long game, if we have a vision that is not just 5 years or the next election cycle, but if we're thinking 50, 100 years down the road, if we're the kind of people who plant oak trees, and are doing what's right, and knowing that it's our great grandchildren who will benefit, then we will find the courage to do the unpopular thing.
Right. And so that, and to hear you say it that way, and I have like so many about the, I did an essay last year for my apologetics and evangelism side, and I talked about the use of the word nice. And it was funny because then you guys on Theology Pugcast ended up talking about it. And it was, this was all swirling around in my mind. So I guess I could do something mystical and say, God was trying to tell me something. But the church today, it has this idea that it's got to be nice. And we define nice as in being pleasant. And really, ultimately, what we end up doing is what you guys talked about on the show, was we end up being worthless, which is what nice really means.
Yeah,
kind of dressed up, gussied up, but really good for nothing. And that's what the church has become. And so now nobody knows how to fight anymore. We don't know how to fight, which is why we're losing denominations.
Right. Yeah, it's a fascinating word. If you do a little, sort of etymological research on the word nice, you discover that it literally means stupid.
Yeah, that stupid, good, like worthless, just nothing. And like,
right.
And what I run into today with Christians who I'm aligning myself with that come from, and you mentioned a Methodist, like I'm surprised that as soon as you said that you had taken some wisdom from a Methodist in the 80s, that like the computer didn't catch on fire, because we're not supposed to be able to do that. But like I'm aligning myself with a broad array of Christians today who, in this fight to take back our culture, still want to approach it in their ideas of being molded into the image of Christ, that somehow that means we can't be forceful, in that we can't take these hard stands. And I'm looking at the war for the cosmos, and I'm saying, no, there are going to be times where we as Christians, as we're fighting for our household, which isn't, and this is why I'm so glad you brought up the imagery of the 3 generations, which of course doesn't just stop with those 3 generations. What was being communicated there was that You have the older generation, you have the parental generation of the image of Aeneas and holding his son's hand. This stretches on in their minds. This goes on forever. This never ends. And we have to have that same vision, but we're not fighting that way. We're not fighting like it means that. And that's going to be, there are going to be times where it's a war, sometimes physically, in a tangible physical sense, and other times it's going to be strictly cultural and spiritual. But nobody wants to fight anymore because we're so wrapped up in what you were saying, which is the marketing or being nice and wooing people. And I'm like, sometimes you have to conquer, which of course, eschatologically, for a lot of people in the United States, just doesn't make any sense because they're all waiting for the end times are here. I just got to bide my time.
Right. Yeah, I think those are all great points.
Do you see it's pretty safe bet you're either on mill or post mill. I'm really doubting that you're dispensational. Or,
yeah,
or
go ahead. I'm post mill. Sure.
Yeah. Do you, as we look around what's happening right now, and there again, there's always a fight. There's always a struggle. Do you believe that the harder the progressives within the church and either secular and even secular progressives, and quite frankly, I'm having a hard time looking at progressives and saying they're Christian anymore because of what they do with the scriptures. But do you see the harder the progressives push within the church and the secular progressives push from the outside of the church, do you see a resurgence coming soon of overall true Orthodox Christian beliefs kind of saying enough's enough and we're taking back the culture? Do you see that happening, or do you think that we're going to see a bigger shrinking away from that in the near years?
Well, I do see. I have a lot of people who reach out to me because of things I've written. So for that reason, I'm very hopeful in the sense that, the very things we've been talking about are things that resonate with a lot of young guys. Generally speaking, it seems to me that guys who were maybe younger than 35 are more open to these things. Kind of guys in their later 30s, 40s, 50s who've, already kind of, drunk the Kool-Aid, as they used to say. Mm-hmm. They're just kind of committed to a particular way of doing things, and they're just not going to change, as far as I can see anyway. But I do see a lot of younger men who are kind of, they're disillusioned with evangelicalism, broadly speaking, and that's a good thing. Because when you think about the word disillusionment, if you have an illusion, it really does need to be dissed. And so what you have is you have this sort of illusion. You've had these illusions about how, the church grows and how cultures are changed and da. And a lot of younger guys are like, well, it doesn't work. That's nonsense. That's, crazy or whatever. Now, some young guys are completely on board with the whole progressive thing, but I'm referring to guys who are obviously not. A lot of these guys are guys who really do want to establish households, and they want to have their households, reflect the reality that we were talking about before. So I'm encouraged by that. I don't have any illusions about things turning on a dime or anything like that. I think that there's a lot of momentum already in play with certain, movements within the church that will take some time to play out. What things will be like 20 years from now, 30 years from now, I can't say, but I do think that if the encouraging things that I'm seeing at the moment continue to grow and prosper, I think that those things could be at a really, vital point by that time. So anyway, I've got, a set of mixed kind of feelings about all, kind of the situation that we're in. On the one hand, as I noted, there are a lot of young guys out there that I'm connecting with that give me reasons to have hope. On the other hand, there's a lot of stuff that I just don't think is going to change, and we're going to see things kind of play out in a way that will, I think, lead to, things kind of petering out. I think a lot of our Christian colleges are going to close in the next 50 years. And maybe that's not a bad thing based on what's going on in some of those places. I think a lot of churches that we now look to for sort of guidance and sort of as models of how to do it are all going to be forgotten. I give you an example. When I was a young man in the 80s, there was a guy named Robert Schuller.
Oh, very familiar with Robert.
Right. Everybody wanted to be Robert Schuller. Everybody thought he was the greatest thing. He was the Tim Keller of his day. Everybody thought that he had the model.
Yep.
He had a national television show. Everybody thought he was great. Anyway, I talk to young people today, and they don't even know who he is.
Yeah.
Anybody younger than 30 years old, I say, there was a guy named Robert Schuller, and they say, really? I had never heard of him. My prediction is that people like, John Piper and Tim Keller and Mark Deaver, all these guys are going to be as forgotten as Robert Schuller.
Really? So that's actually because I cut my early Reformed Baptist teeth on Piper's Tulip presentation, and actually, since you used the word, quickly became disillusioned with him. Yeah. I even took a lot of inspiration from Desiring God, because I saw some things in there that were actually really good, and now I look at some of the idea of Christian hedonism, and I go, I can see why can be troublesome. But
yeah, I guess I should say, I painted things with a pretty broad.
That's okay. I just throw paint everywhere myself. So.
But I guess my larger thought is that we're yet to see what will kind of be the thing that God will do that will bring about the kind of changes that I really believe God will eventually institute in our society. We're under judgment right now, and I think that judgment is going to take some time to play out.
I'm glad to hear you say that we're under judgment. And well, okay, poor choice of words. It's not that I'm glad to hear it. I'm reassured that you're seeing it as well, because I keep running into people who are looking at what's going on, let's just say in 2021, and they're like, oh man, if we don't turn course, we're gonna, God's gonna judge us. And I'm like, I really don't know that. Like, I believe we're actually under judgment right now.
Yeah, I don't see how you can take a look at all this sexual insanity that we see around us and not say that's God's judgment. If you read Romans 1, that's the evidence of the judgment.
Right. And everybody I talk to says, well, that means judgment could come. And I'm like, no, like literally that means he's already judged us.
Yeah. Right.
And then they're like, oh, so then he's returning. And I'm like, well, of course he's going to return, but I mean, that doesn't mean he's returning today.
Right.
And, I don't want to keep you too long. I could keep you on here for quite a while, but you actually have a life and writing projects to do, whereas I just have writing projects to pretend. And I want to turn this a little bit, and not away from completely, but turn it a little bit to Christians now, because we want to fight for our households. What does that look in you had also talked about being, that leaning towards that paleo conservative ideal. And you've talked about it in different places, but what does it look like for a paleo conservative household oriented Christian family, but especially the man, the man of the house? What does that look like today as we go out to engage culture? Because you can't have a household and not go out and engage culture. We see that all throughout the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. Even when you read about the Proverbs 31 wife, it's not just about her.
Right.
Her husband sits in judgment at the gate.
Right.
He's engaging culture. He's making decisions about things because of the strength of his household. What does it look like for someone who wants to have that Christian biblical household view to go out and engage culture in that political sense today? Is there a place for Christians at the grassroots level to go out now and start affecting culture down the road to turn culture around, whether it be 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now? Is there a place for a Christian to do that? Should we be engaging in politics? Should we be engaging in local affairs and at that level? And do we have to be nice to do that?
Right. I think that the book that I wrote, Man of the House, gets into a number of these very practical matters. I think that one of the ways that you do this is by acquiring productive property. When you are an owner of productive property, you play a role in your community that people who lack productive property can't play. Now that means everything from owning real estate that's income producing to owning businesses, maybe intellectual property, whatever. What you have in a situation like that is you have the wherewithal to make a net contribution to your community. Because you're in a position to make a net contribution to your community, you're not a proletarian. In the ancient world, the term proletariat was a label for a freeman without property. That meant essentially the only way a person could survive was by selling his labor. When that's the situation you find yourself in, you're very vulnerable to the sort of the political forces that you have surrounding you. And really, the kind of dependency that we see in our society at so many levels is due to the fact that people they're not stakeholders in the community. They don't own anything. If you really are an owner, people look to you for leadership. People rely on you for work, and they rely on you for your wisdom. And in my book, Man of the House, one of the things I stress is that when people want to bring about some kind of change, people who don't own property or know anyone who does run into the street with a bunch of signs and throw rocks through windows. That's basically an admission that they are impotent, that they have no real leverage in their community. But when you actually possess connections, when you know people who have authority, when you yourself have authority, then you can just pick up the phone and say, "Hey, this is Chris. Hi, Bob. There's a thing going on down at the elementary school that really has some of us parents a little bit uncomfortable. I'd like to talk to you about it."
Yep.
That
gets attention.
That's right. So what we need is people who go out and start businesses, who own property, productive property in communities, and who are believers. And when that's the case, other people call you for help. Say, "Hey, TC, we got a situation here that's a real problem. Do you have any connections at City Hall? Do you know anybody?" And when you do, when you are the kind of guy that everybody in the community knows about and depends upon, and whose opinion is got some weight, then you can make a real difference. So yes, I think that politics, all these things are tremendously important, but I think that we need to enter into these sort of spheres of cultural influence from positions of strength. And the way you do that is by building up your household, by building up your connection to other households. There are things that are going on right now that I think are very encouraging along this lines. I'm not in a position where I can actually talk about some of the stuff I know about, but
That's all right. Once it breaks, then we'll have you back on.
That's right. Right. But there are people out there who are thinking along these lines, and I think one of the problems that we have with Christians is that instead of thinking about these things deeply and sort of realistically, we end up just mimicking the nonsense of Antifa and so forth. That they're not our model. They're morons. They do the things they do because they're impotent. And the only way that they think they can get anything done is by threatening people and deplatforming people and all that crap. What we need to do is we need to build up our communities and build up our households, and so that they have weight in their communities. And if we do that, we are going to have more influence than all those Antifa numbskulls.
And part of that is platforming people who are doing that, who have businesses. It's really kind of neat that you said that, because I actually have on my website for Minnesota Black Robe Regiment, I have a site page on there, and I call it the Patriotic Small Business Owners.
Yeah, those guys are great.
I'm trying to platform these people. We've got a lady here in Minnesota that just got booted out of a 17+ year contract with a local co-op because she stood up as a business owner. She makes paste. I don't know. She's a canditori. She makes candy.
Okay.
and really good candy, chocolates and stuff. And they booted her out of the co-op, her products out of the co-op, because she went to a council meeting as a local business owner with some clout and stood up and said, I'm opposing our school board. I'm opposing critical race theory because it's wrong.
Right.
And they booted her out. And I'm like, hey, I want to talk to you and let's platform you. Let's platform you. Now I'm a little convicted now because I'm one of those proletariat guys. I have property, but I work, a day-to-day job. Sure. But now I feel all inspired, Chris. So now I'm like inspired and convicted and all. Now I have to figure out what I'm good at. In the meantime, as people like me, and I appreciate you keep saying young men, but I'm in that 50 and older age bracket, so I'm just the oddball because I haven't drank the Kool-Aid. But as we look at these younger men, people who are working, that 9-to-5 job, and they're living by working for somebody else, as they start to look ahead in their own lives as a man of the household and as a household, and they maybe aren't in a place right this moment where they can be independent income generating people. Is there still a place for them to go out into the community and take their Christian values into the realm of what's happening in the culture and still be pushing to change the culture back to the roots of how important the household is and bring God back into the mix? Can they still be out there doing that without that influence?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think that's possible, and I think that they really ought to look for allies. I think one of the things that can happen is we get some really courageous people who go out and die on hills all alone, and they'll say, "Okay, I'm going to make this stand," and then they discover that there are a lot of people who give them some, I guess, support in a kind of quiet way, but they kind of feel like they're all alone, kind of taking a lot of hits. I think that what we need to do is work really hard at building coalitions and alliances with our fellow believers, and conservatives, and stand up for each other, like you're trying to do with this woman who's the candy maker. Because I think that if we can do that, if we can come to each other's aid, if we can organize and know going into an encounter that, okay, these are the things that are going to be likely to occur. But we're going to do this anyway because we have these plans to sort of follow up after this. So, if you go to city council or to, the Board of Education, and you make some kind of public statement like this woman made, well, you've got a lot of people who will use you as kind of their, sort of human sacrifice.
Yep.
To placate the gods of political correctness, critical race theory, or whatever. Now, what I think happens too often is that people are surprised when that happens. I think that what we need is be that's right, be completely ready for it and say, okay, we know that when we go into this environment and we make this public stand, there are going to be all these people who are going to use us to sort of placate their false gods. Well, okay. What we're going to do is this and this and this afterward for this person. We're going to try to take these people who have made a sort of human sacrifice and out them for that. There are just a range of things that you can do if you are organized, communicating, realistic, savvy, and committed to the long term. There will still be a lot of bloody noses and people who suffer for their convictions, but at least they won't suffer alone, and at least there'll be some follow-up that we can see play out. Anyway, so yes, the short answer to your question is yes, you can do stuff, but I can't strongly enough encourage you to do stuff with other people.
Right.
Not just die alone on a hill.
Right. Which there again, I think just without, and I know you haven't watched all of my stuff, but that's what I've been, I did not pay him to say this, people. I did not go, hey, Chris, I need you to say these things. This is the natural flow of the conversation. I've been saying this to people. We have to start standing together. And that means we might have to ally with the person who goes to a church that maybe I wouldn't necessarily attend.
Right.
Or who is Christian, but maybe has a slightly different theological perspective on certain types of doctrines than I personally do, and say, look, no, I'm not going to let you stand alone. I'm not going to let you. I'm going to stand with you. And I realize that one of us is probably going to suffer, but we're not going to suffer alone. I mean, there's some place in a book somewhere it said that we're going to be hated for certain things.
Right. Yeah. Chris, getting back to that point, just to finish on, this point, in the academy and in politics, when it comes to the Reformed, our best allies are the traditionalist Catholics. I can't stress that enough. They're the ones who are willing to go to the wall with us.
Yep.
A lot of your mainstream evangelical megachurch friends aren't.
Nope. They're bought into comfort.
Yep.
Because that's what their evangelicalism has taught them, is that that Christianity is about comfort. And quite frankly, even a lot of and I love my pre-mill. I have a very good friend who I affectionately refer to as my token Dispy. He knows who I'm talking about, and I'll make sure I send this particular conversation to him to watch. That's been one of the weaknesses, is that it's the idea that the ship is sinking, and there's no sense in polishing the brass on the sinking ship. And I'm like, no, God's promised us victory, and not in the Seven Mountains Mandate dominionism way of that radical name it and claim it mentality, but he's promised us dominion through him.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not supposed to be sitting here watching for the signs of the end times. We're supposed to go out and engage and fight in culture, which is precisely why we have found ourselves in the position that we're in. And I don't care if you're a Presbyterian, a Baptist, a Methodist, a Assemblies of God, some nondescript community church type. We are in the position we're in because we have abdicated the Christian responsibility to the household to affect culture, period. And now people are starting to wake up and go, well, how do I make a difference? And then we watch people sacrifice themselves and go, ooh, I don't want to be part of that. And I'm like, well, no, you should be. You should be. Chris, I want you to be able to go, and I appreciate your time. One person that you would point us to, of course, beside yourself, for sources of wisdom, that we can look to, read, study today, who's brought biblical perspective to these kind of issues, that maybe has inspired you or caused you to think or challenge some of your preconceived notions. Who's somebody that my friends and listeners could turn to outside of your stuff as well?
Sure. Well, we've already mentioned Doug Wilson. Doug's a great guy. And he cranks out stuff on a daily basis. It just blows my mind how much he produces. Another guy is Tony Esolen. Tony is a traditionalist Catholic who writes really well on family matters, and his books, particularly on boyhood, are just great. So he's a defender of the traditional masculine virtues. So Tony's a great guy. There are, other people out there who I point people to on various subjects. An example would be Allan C. Carlson. Allan is an authority on really the traditional natural family, and was one of the visionaries behind the International Organization for the Family, which sponsors, huge rallies promoting the natural family in different parts of the world. He's a friend of mine, but he's also kind of, an enemy of George Soros. George Soros does anything he can to harm him, which makes
any enemy of George Soros is a friend of mine. So.
That's right. Yeah. So Allan C. Carlson's a great guy. There's a good guy named Rory Groves who's written a book entitled Durable Trades, which is just a great, practical handbook to get into, some of the things we've been talking about. So those are some people I can recommend.
Well, that's amazing. And well, of course, the Theology Pugcast has a couple of other
people
on it. So.
Yeah. Right.
But that's my way of, clout chasing. So, Chris, I really appreciate it. And I can't wait for your book on Lovecraft and Lewis, because I cut my teeth at a very young age on Lovecraft, and people are like, what kind of psycho are you? And I'm like, well, I'm that kind of psycho. And so even yesterday when you mentioned Stephen King's reference to Lovecraft and
Flannery O'Connor.
Yeah, Flannery O'Connor. I was like, this guy is like, you just constantly throwing curveballs at me. They're like, he mentioned Stephen King. What kind of Christian can he be? And I'm like,
Right.
So, hey, thanks for your time. I will, I'll kick you out, and I'll do a close, and I will send you a link to this when it's done. And thanks for the info. Thanks for the kind of helping people to understand how important the household is. And I will make sure people know where to find those books. So
great. Yeah. Thanks, TC. I've enjoyed it. It's been a fun conversation.
Well, you know what? Thank you. That'll go down as I'm writing that down right now, because Normally people are like, I got to go about 2 minutes in. So thank you, Chris. You have a great day, and God bless.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.
Right. I cannot stress enough what you see in CR, what you see in Chris, is Christian humility, but a passion to fight, and those things can go hand in hand. They can intertwine. You can be down to earth and have the intellectual and philosophical perspectives that men like Chris have, and align yourself with people who a lot of times, especially with an evangelical Christianity, people wouldn't even talk about. I like that he referenced a traditionalist Catholic. I have a couple of friends, one in particular who I would consider to be a traditionalist Catholic, who's a dear friend, love him to death. We go to the mat on theology and doctrine, but like, I know we're in the same fight. And Eric, you know who you are. Now everybody else knows your first name, but it's vitally important that we in this fight for culture, we remember the household and how important it is, and which is why this channel exists. We have to know why we're fighting. And if we're not fighting for the household, and I don't mean just like the place where you live, but your household, which is generational, it's generations, like, then why fight? Then why fight? And God has ingrained that into us. He's built that into us. It's the same mentality that inspired the men that became known as the preachers of the Black Robe Regiment, and the laity of the Black Robe Regiment. Because, as I've said so many times, don't forget, the laity were also part of that Black Robe Regiment. They were out there in that war, literally in a war against oppression, against tyrannical rule. And in our nation today, the church has got to wake up and understand that a lot of why we are where we are is a direct result of the fact that the church has been so silent and has been so hands-off cultural warfare. We've been so interested in only doing the easy thing, or being nice, which, as Chris said, is just meant stupid or dumb. Like, Jesus wasn't nice. The church doesn't have a history of being nice. The church doesn't have a history of complacency. That's a modern invention of the Western church, especially in the United States. I'm not here to win culture by being sweet and cloying and really cool to people. I'm here to win culture by fighting for the culture and bringing Christian philosophy and Christian theology and to bear on culture. And I screw it up constantly. Like, I say things I shouldn't say, and I do things that I shouldn't do. But it's a fight that we have to be engaged in, and sometimes that means taking hard stands and doing things that the church would say, oh, I can't do that, because they're going to think I'm a radical. They're going to think I'm weird. Who cares? Who cares what they think? Be the example. Fight for your household. I don't know what else to say other than thanks for watching. And like I said in the beginning, like, comment, and share. Check out Chris's stuff. I'll have links to his website, and listen to the Theology Pugcast, because it's phenomenal. You will grow exponentially as a Christian and as a cultural warrior, just listening to the guys there. Until next time, Sic Semper Tyrannis.